I'm Tim. I'm known for the podcast of the Urban Mystic. For the last 2 years, my co-host and I, Steve Carter, have hosted the podcast of the Urban Mystic, and to date we've done 70 episodes. It started off as an option for what to do during lockdown when the whole world closed down and we couldn't carry on meeting in groups and we couldn't carry on doing and working the way that we had been doing. After lots of thought of what to do and how to create a public face for the kinds of stuff that I do offline, trying to find a way to, I guess, have a wider reach or a broader reach, something that isn't local. I just found that there are a lot of people that I was connecting with, but they're not all in one place. Traditionally, when you're doing this kind of missional work and reaching people and working with their spirituality, you often just try to form groups and get people into a group, and then you start with one group and you keep that group going. You try to gather people into another group and keep that group growing. And when you've got 3 groups going, then you try to start a church. I think that there's a fundamental problem with that, because if you start with doing church, then you end with doing church. If you make doing church your focus, then your work is doing church. And doing church is not about individuals and the quality of their relational engagement with themselves, the quality of their relational engagement with others, or the quality of their relational engagement with God. And that's the fundamental problem. So if you start with doing church, you end up with doing church. Your success is based on whether you can start a church and successfully keep a church going. And we know exactly what doing church looks like. You can go into any number of different churches and you'll see that they're all doing the same thing. They're just doing it in different flavors and varieties. So there's cosmetic differences between them, between how people preach and how people do worship and what's expected in small groups and how you organize your Sunday service. But it runs on the same basic script and you end up doing the same thing. I recognize that that's a significant problem. So if that's the fundamental problem, then I think it's more important that we start from the ground up and we start with what our values are and focus on enabling individuals to cultivate a spirituality that's around that value for intimacy with God, rather than starting with a value for doing church and expecting people to fit into that and get their spirituality out of that. OC Africa did some research a while ago, phenomenal research. I'll link it in the notes. Well, the conclusion to that was that the number one unmet need of church leaders in South Africa, and I think by extension everywhere in the West, because we're all doing church the same way, the number one unmet need is that of intimacy with God. So the people that are running churches, that are hosting churches, that are involved in doing church, in leadership and supportive roles, are not experiencing a fulfilling relationship with God, and doing church is not enabling that either. So the problem actually goes a lot deeper, and the question is, how do we go about solving that? I've made my primary work throughout my whole career in ministry focusing on this problem of experiencing God and this problem of cultivating like a real deep quality relationship that's actually based on experience, that's based on the quality of your communication rather than on the quality of what you project or you assume or you fill in on God's behalf. So towards the end of 2019, I took the risk of stopping absolutely all the work that I was doing with church. Back then I was assisting in planting 2 churches, and I was working as a missional coach, enabling people in churches to start thinking in novel ways about doing different kinds of ministry. And there I just noticed the same pattern repeating, that you've got this core thing called doing church, this core thing, the main thing that you're trying to feed everyone into, and then you've got ways in which you go about reaching people. They end up being quite novel and creative, and they might enable people to continue their journey of finding God and experiencing God. But the minute that they get into church, doing church is what's on offer, and then the very things that they were doing that were enabling them to grow and encounter God is not what they're actually doing in church. And so I just felt that it's not the best use of time and resources to invest in that kind of split. If we are primarily funding doing church and paying people to do church, and we're expecting volunteers to reach people and help them really engage God, and that's where they're getting their quality experiences of God, and then the expectation is that they come to church and then they're left with a gap. How do they then experience God? How do they find what they were getting on their way in? How do they keep that in the context of church? And generally speaking, people don't, and they can't. And so I took the risk of stepping away from that and rebooting everything from the ground up, considering what do we do if we actually move away from doing church and just work with individuals. If we start with the foundation of individuals and their quality of their relational engagement with God, what do we do? What does that actually look like in practice? So in 2019 I took the risk of stopping all that other work, and then we hit the global pandemic and the whole world locked up. back then I thought that the next step would be to find some kind of public facing interface, some kind of way to take the kinds of conversations that I have with people one on one and share them in a public environment, some kind of way to have deep meaningful conversations about what this problem is that could be more productive than just having people invested in doing church, defending what they're doing, as though that's all we've ever done and all we're ever allowed to do. Find a way to have conversations that really look at this problem with doing church, and then look at the solution as to how do we go about experiencing God. So I asked a good friend of mine, Steve Carter, to join me to do this podcast. Back then, he was also working in a missional environment, doing a lot of family counseling and supporting churches. He was also working as a missional coach. That was actually how we met. And the first thing that he said to me is he'd absolutely love to do that, but obviously if he does that, he's just going to get fired. That was really the moment that really just brought home to me this fundamental discrepancy, that if you start really poking at this problem and you really start trying to focus on the solution, you quickly run into the sacred cow of doing church and get stuck in that box. That everything that you do is actually supposed to be about doing church, as opposed to everything that you do is supposed to be about quality engagement.